earned the Distinguished Service Medal, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Stars. Ambassador Cooper served in Vietnam. He also served under the Bush administration in Desert Storm. Ambassador Cooper served in the Alabama State Legislature and in the cabinet of the governor of the state of Alabama. He was appointed by President Bush as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force and served throughout the Bush administration. President Clinton selected him ambassador to Jamaica, where he served for several years. Ambassador Cooper also has a distinguished career in business as well. In 1976, he, along with several others, founded Alabama's first and only minority-owned and operated bank, Commonwealth National Bank, that continues today. He's chairman of CNB Bancorp. He sits on many boards and several banks and many major corporations. Now, I have to tell you that although Ambassador Cooper's undergraduate degree is from another Catholic university, one that's located on the bend of a river in Indiana, Ambassador Cooper did take one course here at Spring Hill College. So please join me in welcoming our one-time Badger, our guest speaker, Major General Ambassador Cooper.
Thank you very much, Father. I'll remind him before we go, the Marines fight, we get Purple Hearts, not Purple Stars. but you were close.
Sorry.
And that little school by the bend of the river that I graduated from, it's called Notre Dame. It's good to be here with you today. I'm really thrilled. You know, Ken Burns and Tom Brokaw are very famous for their documentaries and their television programs, and they have done an awful lot about the greatest generation that fought in the Second World War. And in that war, there was a great battle on a small, isolated island in the Pacific. 3 Marines were captured, a private, a staff sergeant, and a general. And the enemy declared that they were going to put these 3 Marines to death, but they would give them one last wish. And the PFC was from down around Miami, and he wanted some burritos before he died. The staff sergeant was from up around Atmore, and he wanted some chitlins. And boy, the enemy didn't know what to do. They were running all around. They had never heard of these things. And when they asked the general, what did he want to do? And he said he wanted to give the greatest speech in his life. And he wanted a roll of paper and some pen. And the private, who hadn't yet got this food, he said, "Sir, I've changed my mind." And they said, "Well, what do you want?" He said, "Just shoot me before the damn general starts talking." So I guarantee you that I'm not going to be too long and hopefully not too boring. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, about 5 to 10 blocks back behind the auditorium. And those were some interesting days in Alabama, really, really segregated. And during those days, if you were an African American, it didn't matter whether you were light-skinned like me or black as Ace of Spades. You were totally segregated. And during those days, I was the oldest of 6. Very lucky. My parents were college graduates. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Hampton University. And I was fortunate enough to have a grandfather who graduated from a great school called Fisk over 100 years ago. But all that didn't matter. If you were black, you were in deep trouble back in those days. Now, I'm talking about in the 50s. Many of you have heard about riding in the back of the bus. Look, that was the least of your damn problem, riding in the back of the bus. We couldn't even walk through the Enville Square, let alone sit down. You couldn't walk through it. You couldn't use bathrooms. The movies were all segregated. When I go to the Singer Theater downtown, you have to call up and go and voucher. And those were some interesting days, because every once in a while when we get acting a little crazy, we drop little things down off the balcony on folks. We won't tell you what it was we dropped. It wasn't very clever. But we did not like those days in Mobile. And listen, unfortunately, the Catholic Church didn't help much at all. We had a parade celebrating the feast day of Christ the King. And boy, this was quite a parade. All the Catholic schools marched. Guess where the black Catholic schools marched? In the back of the parade. And if we go to Mass at the cathedral, guess where we had to sit? In the last two rows. So I recently read a history of the Archdiocese of Mobile. Have some of you seen that nice history? Well, you should read it, because it sounds like a fantasy. It's not very much like history that many of us remember. And people would call your parents names. That was very, very humbling. And humbling in many, many ways. But guess what helped? And I'm sure one would wonder, how do you grow up on a dirt street in Mobile during the segregated days and end up becoming a Marine general and an ambassador of the United States? You know, how does that happen? And I'm going to sort of take you through some things that made it happen for me. And I think maybe as we move along, you see some things that you can do that one day will make you congressmen, senators, presidents of the United States a great business people. But one thing that helped was that I was able to go to Catholic school. I went to an elementary school called St. Peter Claymore that was located on the south side of town. And then I went to a high school called Most Pure Heart of Mary. And it's on the street now called Martin Luther King Drive. It used to be Davis Avenue, named after Jefferson Davis, the first president of the Confederacy. And Heart of Mary was a great school. We had Dominican nuns from Cincinnati, Wisconsin, who taught us. And they did not play. You had to do it the right way, or your parents would know about it before you got home. But one thing that I remember, we had a nun, Sister Elogia. Little short woman with a big scar on the side of her face, and she was a great geometry teacher. And Sister Elogia used to read us a poem at the end of each of her classes. And it had about 3 verses. And at the end of every verse, it ended saying, remember, there's always room at the top. Remember, there's always room at the top. And many of us remember that. And I was fortunate enough at home that my parents demanded good grades. And I learned to know that good grades were important because they stay with you all your life. So while at Heart of Mary, my father and some local men decided they wanted to build a hospital. Because guess what? Black women could not go to hospitals in Mobile, Alabama. They couldn't get in Providence, they couldn't get in Mobile Infirmary. So when you had a child, you either had to go home to your mama or find a midwife or a doctor to come to your home. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And that was only in the 40s and 50s. In raising this money to build this hospital, which is now located down on Virginia and Washington Avenue, for those of you from Mobile, a Catholic archbishop named Fulton Sheen. Fulton Sheen was the Archbishop of New York. And he was one of the first clerics on television. He was famous. And he heard that this group was trying to raise money so that our women could have babies in hospitals and go. And he came to Mobile and came to my house. Police lights flashing on this dirt street. Right down here, we call it down the bay. And he came in and he talked to my dad about how he could help them raise money. And then he asked me, where was I going to college? And I really didn't know. And he asked me, had I ever heard of Notre Dame? And he told me that if I decided to go to Notre Dame, that he would write a letter for me, a recommendation. And I still have that letter. And contrary to what a lot of people think, I didn't get a basketball scholarship. I I got an academic scholarship. And it was pretty interesting. But because my mother could not get in the hospital, she went back to Lafayette. And that's where I was born, in Lafayette, Louisiana. Have you folks been over to see the battleship? How many of you have been to the battleship park? Well, this is an interesting story. I had a buddy of mine, a lawyer, write a letter to the battleship authority. And they say, on the battleship, you have pictures of general officers from Alabama. And they wrote back and said, and he said, why didn't Cooper's picture up? And they told him that they had checked my records and that Cooper was not born in Alabama, that he was born in Louisiana. So my buddy wrote back and said, you know, hell, the reason he was there, you wouldn't let him in the hospital. But that didn't matter. They wouldn't put my picture up. So one day in life, I was assistant secretary there for manpower, personnel, installation. So I had all the bases in the world under me. All the people, guard, reserve, and active duty, were under my supervision. And guess what I had? Museums. And one year, the Air Force had 4 airplanes. The SR-71, I think, it's called the Blackbird. And guess who wanted a Blackbird? Guess who? The Battleship Park. And guess whose picture got on that wall real fast? Interesting how that works, isn't it? But that's the importance of being around the table. And while I was growing up down the bay, I mentioned the theaters being segregated, but we had a black theater there called a Harlem Theater. And on Sunday they had double features. And what that means, you saw the same movie twice. But I went once and I saw a movie called The Sands of Iwo Jima. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It was so long ago. But it had a great actor in it called John Wayne. And John Wayne played a role of a Marine sergeant named Sergeant Stryker. And when I saw how bad Sergeant Stryker was, I knew I wanted to be a Marine. So that was kind of in the back of my head. So I can honestly say that John Wayne recruited me in that movie. So I ended up going to Notre Dame, and I was in the class of 1954. I got a notice last week that, guess what, next year, I go to my 55th reunion. Can you imagine that? 55 years since I graduated from Notre Dame. I was in a class of 1,500, and there were 3 African Americans. 3 African Americans in a class of 1,500. And it was a great experience for me going to Notre Dame. Great experience. And I am convinced that my experience at Notre Dame helped me become very senior in the Marine Corps. Because until I went to Notre Dame, I don't think I'd ever been in a room with 3 white folks. Never in a room with them. All the way up through high school. But at Notre Dame, I got a chance to live with people from all over the country, all over the world. A school with great diversity. So consequently, when I got in the Marine Corps, diversity was really not a problem for me. But it continued to be very challenging. When I got commissioned in 1958 at Notre Dame at my graduation, there were 20,000 officers in the Marine Corps. 20,000. And 6 of them were black. I was 25. And somebody said, what does that mean? It meant you couldn't have a damn bad day. That's for sure. And it was a challenge, but you know what? There were a lot of people around who were very helpful. I never would have done any of the stuff that I have made. Would not have been for my seniors and other people who were senior to me, who gave me guidance. And there were many times that they could have ruined my career. Because sometimes my judgment was not as good as it should have been. And guess what? They held my hand and told me better ways to do things. And I still keep in touch with many of these seniors and seniors enlisted me. And what was so interesting, I don't know if any of you heard of the Montfort Point Marines. Anybody heard of the Montfort Point Marines? Let me tell you about it. In 1940, when we went to war, the Marine Corps was segregated. And they would not accept black Marines. And even though the other services had, the president had to call the Marine Corps and direct them to allow black men to become Marines. And they came from all over. But they wouldn't send them to Paris Island, to boot camp. They sent them to a segregated base called Montfort Point near Camp Lejeune in South Carolina. And these men served with great honor. In fact, two of the most famous ones are from Alabama. Hashmark Johnson and Edgar Huff. They went to Stillman up in northern Alabama and served our country for 30 or 40 years and left a great record. But what was also very interesting, when I was a young lieutenant, these old Marines were first sergeants and master sergeants. And when they see the lieutenant do something wrong, they call me over and tell me. And it's interesting how these people helped me and how other people all over just played a great role in my career. But it, it continued. I got assigned to be the commanding officer of the Marine Detachment on the cruiser Chicago. Chicago was a brand new guided missile cruiser being built at Hunters Point in San Francisco. And on the way to join this cruiser, when I get to the Marine barracks at Hunters Point, they tell me to delay en route, not to report aboard ship. So I stayed at the Marine barracks for about a week, and then finally I got orders to tell me to proceed. And I didn't know until 10 years later, an old Marine called me over and he said, Colonel, said, you know why they told you not to go? He said they had never sent a black officer aboard a Navy ship, and they had to get permission from the Navy. Now that was in '64. And then I went to Vietnam. And when I got to Vietnam, I knew that in order to get promoted, I had to have combat, because Marines are fighting men, and women now too. And I knew I had to have combat, but when I reported, the name was our big base there, was like a mud field. And I go and check in, and they tell me that I'm going to become a supply officer. And I say, hey, I'm not a supply officer, I'm an infantry officer. And they said, no, you're going to this little Antos, which was a mechanical vehicle. And I said, hell, I'm 6'6", I can't even fit in that damn thing. How am I going to the Antos? And finally, I had to make a special request to the commanding general. And I got command of a Marine infantry company. And I knew it then, and I didn't know quite how important it was, but that was the first time in the history of the Marine Corps that an African American had ever commanded Marines company. So somebody said, boy, you're talented. No, my timing was real good. I happened to show up at the right places at the right time. Now, when I was on the Chicago, and I'm going to mention this to you later, I was out at sea, and I had my own stateroom, and I was thinking, what am I going to do with my career? I like being a Marine. I like those uniforms. The men should know you stop at a red light, the ladies would jump in the car. You'd have to fight them off, when you had those dress blues on. And so I knew I liked being a Marine. And then I thought of the generals I'd seen, and they seemed like so-so. They didn't seem that damn sharp to me. So guess what? I wrote, and then I remembered Sister Elogia. I remember Sister Elogia telling me, said, remember, there's always room at the top. So guess what? I wrote a note to myself. And I sealed this note, and I put, that was 20 years later, I put open, and I mailed it to my kids. And 20-some years later, I was in a hotel with a hell of a hangover in Atlanta one morning. And I got a call from the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. And he said, Colonel Cooper, I called to congratulate you. You have been selected to become a brigadier general. And you should know becoming a general in the Marine Corps is like getting hit by spaceship Atlantis out here on Old Shell Road. That's how tough it is. But I called my kids, and guess what that note said? It said, did you make it, Cooper? Yes, you did. And I have it framed now, and it's now in the African American Archives on Martin Luther King. So if you ever get over there, you will see an example of setting a goal, writing it down, and accomplishing it. And it's there hanging if any of you would like to see it. And so I've told you these things about how tough things were. But you know, we live in a great country, and we've seen tremendous changes. And these changes have been caused by the sacrifices of people like Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King, and Lyndon Johnson, and Fred Shuttlesworth, and John LaFleur here in Mobile, and many others. And the sacrifices that these people have made have created something that I call the miracle of America. You find it no place else in the world. And what is this miracle? This miracle has created a meritocracy. How many people know what a meritocracy is? Just see a hand. Oh, nobody can tell me? Okay. A meritocracy is a system where you're judged by your ability, by your hard work, and what you accomplish. That's a meritocracy. You can start your race on the same starting line as anyone else. Your track is flat, and you're not held back. For the most part, we know we still have problems, but you're not held back by your race, your background, whether your poverty, and such and such. And that's the miracle of America. No place else doesn't exist. And how do you know it still exists? I met a sharp young lady from Jamaica. When I was ambassador, every morning I had thousands, not hundreds, thousands of people at the embassy. And in other countries too. And why are they there? Because they want to come to the United States of America. Why? Because we live in a country where if you work hard, it's based on your merits. So how do you take advantage of it? How do you, in this meritocracy, take advantage of it? You're very fortunate, God, to be freshmen in college, and to have you've got all these years to build your life. And it's so important. So what do? One thing you do is you continue your education. And you take your education very seriously. Get mediocrity out of your vocabulary. Don't be satisfied with C's and D's or whatever it is. Because they're with you all your life. Anybody can keep mediocre. But you should make sure that you make yourself someone special. The other one you got to do is pick your friends. It's amazing how you can pick some idiot to be a button. Have you heard this, that friends are like buttons on an elevator? Some will take you up and some will take you down. So if you got a buddy who's a lazy ass, doesn't do anything, don't let them take you down. You can still be nice to them. But you find someone who has some ambition and who has a desire to also achieve. Now, how do you make it happen? Young officers in the Marine Corps are taught principles and leadership traits. And these things are not mysteries. In fact, in 500 BC, Sun Tzu, a military theorist, wrote about the military principles and traits that you must develop. I'm going to leave a package of these traits for you. And if you're interested in really succeeding in life, you read these principles and you develop these traits. Now, what are these traits you've got to develop? No leader gets them all right. But the first one is integrity. That's key. Whatever you do, there must be integrity. Another one that's very important is enthusiasm. I remember I had a secretary who worked for me once, and I said, "How's it going?" "Oh, so-so." I said, "Hell, you can go so-so and work for somebody else." But enthusiasm will help get you there. Good judgment. Wow. You see signs of that all the time. When you do something, think what your mama would think if she saw it. Or how would it look on the front page of the paper? And a good way to make decisions, I don't know how many of you have taken accounting classes where you have the T-square, and on one side you put the pros, the good things that will happen, and on the other side you put the bad things that will happen. And hopefully you got a friend, and you might tell this friend, say, "This is what I think," and the friend will say, "You've done so much wrong." Say, "Don't do that." So before you make major decisions, write the pros and the cons. And that's what you call using good judgment. And then I guess I'll say one thing to remember, with all of our problems, all of us, we have problems in the United States. Also, but remember, on America's worst day, on our worst day, there's not a better place to live. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions. What about some questions? Somebody must have some. No questions? Oh, another one I wanted to tell you that I didn't tell you. You know, people tell you that life is rough, life is really tough. Guess what? It's a lot tougher if you're stupid. So remember that, okay? Okay, what we got? Anything? No questions? No questions? Yes, sir.
I'll start one. I was kind of interested, the traits you just talked about, I'm sure transferred from the military to being an ambassador to working in business, but were there some skills, like in the military, you had to almost unlearn to be an ambassador? Or, are there different things that you had to learn, new ways of approaching?
Yeah, I did. Being an ambassador was very difficult for me because when you're an ambassador, if somebody really tees you off, you sit down and you talk about it. You know what I want to do is kick. So it took me a while. Yeah, we tend to be a little authoritarian in our leadership style as an ambassador in the military. And in the ambassador, you talk things through and work things out. So you're right, that was difficult to transfer. But now, all of these can be transferred to your civilian life. And now these were written many years ago. So the great thing about them is that the computers and the new articles in the Harvard Business Review and such, you can still apply them. And it's been proven. If you look at Condoleezza Rice, General Patton, Colin Powell, whoever they are, they have it. Particularly Jefferson. When you look at some of the mistakes that politicians make, can you believe what they were thinking about? Unbelievable. And that's what you call no justice. So again, we live in a great country, and people are dying to get here, and let's remember this, but let's remember, if it is to be, it's up to you. So let's make it work. Okay, question. Yes, sir.
You mentioned John LaFleur. Did you know John LaFleur? And can you tell any stories about your...
Yeah, John LaFleur was a civil rights leader. And in 1973, I had been home from the Green Corps, and guess what? Before that time, blacks did not run for office. And they reassigned the boundaries. So I ran for the legislature. And I ran in Oakley, and I won in a majority white district. I was a conservative compared to the lady who was great that I ran into. And John LaFleur, who John LaFleur's school is named after, also got elected. And I sat next to John LaFleur. But John LaFleur was a postman who protested segregation and racism. In fact, his home was bombed twice here in Mobile, and he was quite a guy. Quite a guy. This is a good one. Since I would drive by Atmore every day going to Montgomery, we passed the prisons. So I got concerned about the prisons. So I would go in, and it's amazing. They beat the suit with pig eyes in. I mean, horrible. The places were filthy. And I helped get some bond issues passed. But in the entire prison system, there was not one minority in any senior position, even though many of the prisoners were. So I went to see Governor Wiley. He said, Governor, I'm going to work and get this bill passed to get more money. But what I'd like you to do is to appoint a black man as deputy prison commissioner. Governor shook my hand and said, all right, we will do that. And so I go to summer camp. And while I'm at summer camp, somebody calls me and tells me that George Wallace had appointed somebody else who was not a minority. And his name was, I don't know, anybody here named Fochie? Anyway, his name was Ken Fochie. And he had just gotten out of prison. So when I go to see the governor, I said, well, Governor, why did you do this? He said, well, he's my friend, and at least he's got prison experience. That's a true story. George Wallace looked me in the eye and told me that. Interesting day. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that we're asking the students to do is to consider leadership and heroism and how they're similar and how they're different. So how would you define what is a hero?
You know, that's a tough one. Yeah. Well, I think I would define it academically as someone who puts someone else's concerns and safety above their own physical safety. But the reason it's so difficult is we had this young Marine who recently got the medal on, who was really not in any type of leadership position, but he almost gave his life saving someone else. Makes me think of Vietnam. But in Vietnam, I had a guy in my unit who was a sniper, and his name was Carlos Castro. And the battalion came and they wanted to take Castro out and put him in a sniper. Anyone here has heard of Carlos Castro? His book is called One Shot, One Kill. And he killed an NBA general. So they assigned an NBA sniper to find Halfcock and kill him. So Halfcock knew this NBA sniper was coming after him. And he stayed down, he crawled, they spent a couple of nights, and finally he fired at this NBA sniper. And the round went through his telescope into his eye. That's how sharp Halfcock was. That's not a jury. But I can say he didn't wink that eye anymore. What about anything else? Well, listen, I am honored to be here, but write your goals down. Doesn't matter where you're from, what your parents did, whatever. If it's something you want to do, you can do it. And I wish you the best of luck. Like we Marines say, have a great one. Thank you so much. And here are the leadership principles and traits that I'm leaving with the professor. And any of you who would like copies of them, she will make them up. I got another handout in here, I think, called When to Keep Your Mouth Shut. But all of you should get a copy. More people get in trouble opening their mouth when they should be listening. It's amazing. So that's one they'll enjoy. Thank you.
That's so awful. I mean, I'm gonna take a step back and say, not now.
He's already asked for coffee, so we're gonna make sure Chris gets some.
But I think like, he, and so did she make copies.
No, I'm okay.
I'll have copies available. Okay? Yeah,
I just did 2 years on the Navy ship.
we have to make a copy.
Thank you. You're majoring in marketing.
I tried, yeah. Okay, where? Bye, Beck. I know, almost did.